Greetings. I'd like to spend a little bit of time today talking about paradigms and terrorism and trying to take some other work from the philosophy of science and apply it to terrorism studies. First, let me begin by defining the term paradigm. And I will use George Ritzer's definition from his 1975 work looking at sociological paradigms. The paradigm, to quote George Ritzer from page 7 of his book, the paradigm is the broadest unit of consensus within a science and serves to differentiate one scientific community or sub-community from another. End of quote. Basically, what we have here is our model of carrying out our science, our practice. And so there usually is a major paradigm or the dominant paradigm, and then there's some peripheral paradigms, or there's some emerging paradigms, and so we'll talk about that briefly. Let me go ahead and also discuss a little bit the work of Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher of science, who conducted an analysis of physics and scientific revolutions in physics. He published his work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in 1970. And this has been a work that almost every student I'm aware of who is in graduate school reads his book. And you don't have to be an expert in physics or even understand physics to really grasp the genius of Thomas Kuhn's work in trying to look at how science changes or materializes or moves through different phases or stages. And basically he believed that science, at least in physics, moved through several stages. First, there is the dominant paradigm, which we'll call paradigm number one. So paradigm number one is the one that's used by a majority of scientists in that particular field. And when we're doing business as usual, that's referred to as normal science. Normal science. The dominant paradigm. If you think about it today, you might look at, for example, psychotherapy, and maybe the dominant paradigm there, I would guess, would be cognitive behavioral. And psychiatry, the dominant paradigm would be the medical model with the use of medications. But there's certainly some paradigms where you'll find combinations. For example, those that would use medications and psychotherapy simultaneously. Well, the whole idea is that there's a dominant paradigm in normal sciences practice, business as usual. But as we develop and we research, we find anomalies. Things just don't quite match up. There's some holes in the structure of our theories, some unanswered questions maybe, or some contradictory findings in the research. And so these anomalies, when they get too much for the scientific paradigm, the group of scientists to handle, there becomes a crisis, a scientific paradigm crisis. And this often will lead to a revolution or a new paradigm emerging, which will be paradigm number two, which then becomes the dominant paradigm. So we kind of have these phases, dominant paradigm one, normal science, anomalies, crisis, revolution, and then paradigm two. And this recycles and recycles. It's a cyclical pattern in that sense. And we've demonstrated in different research areas, for example, in sociology and in psychotherapy, that there's often multiple paradigms operating, and there may actually be paradigms operating from different sciences completely that don't even communicate much with each other. When I attempt to apply this whole model of paradigms to terrorism, I start asking some questions and trying to look at some features. For example, I wonder, well, how do terrorist groups differentiate themselves from others? Do they label themselves terrorists? Who labels them terrorists? How do we know terrorist groups from non-terrorist groups? What are the defining characteristics, and do those change? For example, now we certainly, and in the recent years, we have to consider cyber terrorism, something that was unheard of many, many years ago, and actually not that long ago. If you're my age, you remember the, maybe going through your undergraduate or being in college or even high school, and not even having access to computers and all this technology. And we also want to look at how different terrorist groups use different models of conducting their terrorism, and how researchers, scientists, law enforcement, criminal justice, the legal system develops their theories to explain terrorism and their methods of studying terrorism and terrorist acts. And so we kind of have this multiple paradigm philosophy going on here, that we know the problem in defining terrorism or terrorist groups is very prominent in the literature and research, but we also can look at different methods of the study of terrorism. For example, those that are working in the strict forensic sciences may look more at the the hard science, the chemistry of terrorism, ways to detect, for example, bioterroristic pathogens with specific scientific measurement tools, which is extremely different from social scientists who are trying to figure out how terrorists tend to think, or what differentiates those that have terrorist thought processes from those that would actually carry out a terrorist act. And then how do terrorist groups change over time? Interestingly enough, if you look at the history, some groups that were defined as terrorists now are referred to as governments of nation states. And then how are laws constructed and implemented to address terrorism? And Kolko and Horn pointed out in their research on paradigms that we can resolve these paradigm conflicts, or the competition can lead to multiple paradigms, or an old paradigm is replaced by a new paradigm. And in some ways, in criminal profiling, we might see the same scenario going on, where maybe we are in a crisis. We're not quite sure if a lot of the previous criminal profiling strategies, techniques, theories, and ideas actually work. Then moving on, in the next video, what I'd like to do is to look at several authors who have very creatively looked at what has been going on historically regarding terrorism, and then try to use that information to extrapolate, predict, project what they think will be going on in the next 5, 10, 15, 25 years.